Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Keat TV in Northern California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Please, before we get started, remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. This public television station is putting the time and resources into what may be the most important topics to ever confront mankind: the questions of non-human intelligence, contact, and humanity's potential to embrace a broader cosmic identity. Help us continue this conversation. On today's show, we sit down with neuroscientist Pascal Michael, who I first met earlier this year at the Contact in the Desert conference near Palm Springs. His work revolves around exceptional human experiences and tracking how those states and conditions map in the brain and help punctuate the broader gestalt of human personality, even allowing for its seeming transcendence. By tracking how psychedelics like psilocybin and DMT impact the brain and comparing those conditions with that of other anomalous experiences, such as psi, NDEs, and alien abduction, Michael is working to identify patterns in the data that may tell us more about the nature of mind and of visionary episodes. He is a bridge between hard science and mystical experience, between spiritual epiphanies and their neurological correlates in the brain. And despite his academic expertise and thorough education, he resists the easy path of reductionism and dogma. He is, put simply, a student of the mystery. As such, he's chosen to not limit himself to the laboratory and to experience psychedelics like DMT for himself, assuring that his research and its conclusions include, but are not subservient to, the baffling power of visionary episodes and the realms they reveal. Please enjoy. To start off, though, can we sort of talk about what your area of study and expertise is and what drew you initially to that subject?
Yeah. Ultimately, I guess my expertise at the moment would be around psychedelics and near-death experiences, because that's what my whole doctorate was on, looking at the interrelationality between the two of those. It was pretty neuroscientifically couched. My original degree is like neuroscience and like clinical mental health science, and so yeah, where I kind of apply that kind of more theoretical or mechanistic framework to these other transpersonal phenomena, which really the pivotal things that I've always kind of parallel to that been dabbling in my own reading and conversations and light research about things like alien abduction phenomena. Really, it's kind of like this Trinitarian thing for me. I like many researchers, there's research is infinite, but the researcher's time and resources certainly aren't. So it's really the three, like psychedelics, near-death experiences, and now kind of increasingly ufological stuff sort of generally, but because my background is more neuroscience and psychology stuff, like it's really the alien abduction phenomenon which I can actually apply my real tools to in a more kind of effective way.
Okay.
Sort of say that to begin with. Yeah.
Well, so now, I came at this from the ufological perspective. I started the show once I got sort of sucked into the whole conversation around UFOs, NHI, and consciousness, and that has since led me down a whole lot of paths, but it seems to revolve around the nature of consciousness and how that relates to the universe, whether there is some sort of inherent connection between the two. And so that's where a lot of my conversations have been going. Within that conversation, though, there's a lot of statements made about the nature of consciousness and also the relationship between consciousness and the brain. And I've seen that you've done some work on that. I've read a series of papers that you and Bruce Grayson kind of batted back and forth regarding near-death experiences and that sort of thing. And those were fascinating, a little bit over my head, but I appreciated the vigor of the arguments. So I guess, let's start there in terms of, there's a lot of statements made about what people know and think about the nature of the brain and how it relates to consciousness. From your perspective, what is the nature of consciousness as it relates to the brain? Or is it an open question to you? Or do we live in a universe that's conscious? What are your thoughts on that?
It certainly is an open question. Anybody on the planet, I mean, I actually have some of my own ideas on that, but I think ultimately you can say, like, anybody on the planet, if they were to say that they have, or they to express with any like unmitigated like confidence what that relationship is between the brain and consciousness, like they're not really reliable narrators, you know. But yeah, I mean, the brain, it's just, I mean, even in the kind of later philosophical kind of discussions, that there's this movement from the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which is how, you know, the question of how does phenomenal awareness actually arise from physical matter? Like, if that's the presumption in the mainstream neuroscientific circles, then obviously that's the the question. But that is kind of a movement toward that the meta problem, because it's like it may be that metaphysically it may actually not be a totally solvable problem. And so now the kind of a lot of discussions now is like, well, um why do we even think, why do we even conceptualize it as a problem? It's very meta. So it's becoming kind of a bit more higher order kind of psychological matter, which I think can kind of help clarify what the connection is, by even asking why we confounded by the question of the relationship, which is very interesting. But yeah, I mean, from, if I could think about from just my, you know, readings and research, and primarily, you know, psychedelics and NDEs, then especially with the NDE thing, then you basically come across all of these different models of how NDEs come about. And if you look at the kind of early literature, it's always this like boring lists of like, oh, you know, people have suggested like, is it hypoxia, or is it, you know, is it sort of microseizures in the brain? Is it like the release of like chemicals? And that really doesn't get anyone anywhere, really, because it's especially when they say about hypoxia, because ultimately it kind of betrays that they don't really get it, because with the near-death experience, like when the brain is the central nervous system is fundamentally at a point of hypoxia or anoxia, like no oxygen diffusion to the brain. So that's the kind of final convergence point of any kind of etiology, like cause of a near-death like state. And that, like, the real final kind of idea being that if that's a given, then what does that then produce in the nervous system, which may then correlate to the kind of phenomenology, the type of like experience that we see in the NDEs, right? So that's, you know, going to be things like the release of protective compounds in the brain, like ketamine, like, I mean, totally speculative, this ketamine like compounds, because they are, yeah, they've shown to, or at least ketamine is shown to be neuroprotective. So in a hypoxic state, then it's very likely that there's been some conserved evolutionary mechanisms for the release of these kind of compounds to preserve, you know, to maximize the kind of likelihood of survival of the organism, stuff like that. But yeah. But interestingly, like with DMT, there has actually been some evidence in like in other mammalian models, like actually when they have cardiac arrest, it's like release of DMT, like significant release, but we haven't seen that in humans. But so yeah, there's multiple things like that. And then, but I think in more the kind of very latter stage of this research, there was like withdrawal, some studies on life support withdrawal, where they had basic kind of EEG setups called the bispectral index monitors, and basically just for anesthetists to just sort of get a general reading of the state of consciousness, like the level or depth of anesthesia, and therefore like unconsciousness that patients are in and stuff. And when life support was withdrawn from several papers on this now, there's like these big spikes, like high frequency, and some of them are kind of confirmed as like actual gamma, you know, spectrum activity going on. And then actually in very recent years, there's been studies on people who, so not just like with life support withdrawal, but actually like there was one, funnily enough, on my birthday a couple of years ago, which was quite cool. Which was just published on someone who accidentally passed away, had a heart attack when undergoing like routine clinical EEG
I
because they
think
had like a previous aneurysm.
I think I read about this, but go ahead, please. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of confirming a bit more like in a more nuanced way that there's this kind of surging of high frequency, high coherency like gamma activity, which is an important index of high conscious processing, right? At least like to the kind of same, if not greater kind of processing capacity of normal EEG measurements of like waking consciousness, which is really interesting because that's actually something that really parallels the psychedelic neuroscience, where there's these kind of revolutionary findings that these indices of entropy, so like chaos in the brain, in a kind of broad stroke of things, but yeah, it's a this particular computational measure of information in the brain, but which is a good corresponder of richness of conscious experience, right? So that was us known to be like diminished in like coma states and things, but it's also so it's been looked at in different conditions, but not actually in the psychedelic state until lastly, and and it was found to be greater than normal waking consciousness, right? So it's kind of giving this more neuroscientific rigor to this kind of old hippie idea that having a psychedelic experience is like expanded consciousness, So that's sort of what I'm saying is that mirrored what's going on in the near death kind of research of this bursting of high frequency like frontal usually activity in at near death. So but not exclusively frontal. Actually, it's only like some of those studies. It's actually a global event. So yeah, I mean this all is very, very convincing that there's something despite the NDE and all of its lucidity and vividness and profundity, and even the kind of extreme effects that has on people, because indeed, like, if there is this mirroring of psychedelic experiences, like we have a big corpus of data now about how single psychedelic experiences can have these enduring changes for years. So but then ultimately, what I always come back to, and maybe you remember that from the sort of this ping pong between myself and Grayson, is that there is also like this parallel kind of corpus of information about the inexplicable kind of anomalous phenomena associated with NDEs. And so I don't think it's it's certainly an impasse, but I think that there are. I always kind of come back to this sort of William Jamesian sort of original idea in the early 1900s of like this black swan, and if you can have these compelling models of a more kind of, let's say, like reductionistic paradigm or whatever, but then it's not even just every now and then, it's quite frequent when you just invest the time, where these instances and cases come up which you can't really readily apply any of the known models, even these more rigorous, like cutting edge ones of the specific activity that we're elucidating more and more near the end of life. So.
Yeah. So to back up a little bit, one question I had from what you just said is that one of the sort of accepted bits of common knowledge among people who really don't know what they're talking about, but want to make an argument for consciousness being something pivotal to the whole universe or whatever, is that in near-death experiences and also in psychedelic experiences, there's an explosion of experiential activity, yet the activity in the brain seems to decrease. That's what you're saying is not true now, that they've seen that there's a kind of activity that is higher than normal waking consciousness that seems to happen, at least with psychedelics. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I come across that argument all the time, and it's like, yeah, it kind of is frustrating to say the least, but also I guess I see it as like a kind of public responsibility for like public education and stuff. It's because it's yeah, this like idea that they found some evidence. I mean, it was early evidence. It's like that. I guess they're just not kind of catching up to the later of the research, and they kind of fixated on these like earlier kind of headline things. The first neuroimaging studies with psilocybin and LSD and stuff. So yeah, they found that there was this reduction in activity, but it was a reduction in activity of particular network of the brain, like the so-called like default mode network, which is itself this important higher order network, which is executive, and so it has this top-down relationship the nexus of the brain, and so it's ultimately like inhibitive. So when that's reduced, when an inhibitive thing is itself inhibited, you just get disinhibition. And so I mean, if there was significant disinhibition, then why didn't they also see an increase in activity in the brain, which they didn't see? But they then later did, with more sophisticated technology and neuroimaging and computational models and stuff. So there's this, like I said before, like this kind of increase in entropy, but it's like different. It's quite like nuanced now. It's like it's not global in the brain, like it's quite differential in the brain. Different areas of the brain may have like mostly increased entropy, maybe some have like decreased. But yeah, and also just connectivity in the brain. And so when you extrapolate that to more of these theories of consciousness which attempt to be unified, there's this idea of integration. Like there's this one major theory called integrated information theory, where I mean it's basically the connectivity of different nodes of the brain, which is paramount for what we then experience as the richness of our conscious experience. And so if that's what happens with psychedelics, like this greater connectivity between networks, so normally, so our brain has evolved, on just inordinately complicatedly beyond our own brain to even like wholly like comprehend, I think, in this wonderful paradoxical kind of way. So, but in a way that it's the everything we see from a very like evolutionary neurobiological perspective, like the architecture of our brain is ultimately for like evolutionary kind of reasons. So there's a differentiation between networks of the brain, which are like very specialized, and when suddenly there's actually a merging of those networks, so there's this correlation of their activity under psychedelics, when usually they're not correlated, right? It's like they're acting independently. Like that's what makes sense of the actual content of the psychedelic experience, when it's basically just, it can feel like chaos. It's like there's all this paradox of like the blending of your sensory experience, of your cognitive faculties, with your sensory experience, and all of that. And of course it can feel exceptionally transcendent as well, but so that level of connectivity which is happening, that in the broader scheme of like these theories of consciousness, for instance, kind of can make sense. So so that's interesting that we also see comparable things with NDEs as well. So
so now, I mean, those two, the linkage between NDEs and psychedelic experience, and then also you mentioned alien abduction. How does that fit in terms of your research? What are you seeing that sort of wants you to link those three phenomenon up?
That's definitely my overarching kind of project, because thus far the kind of relationship between psychedelics and near-death experiences is gaining like more traction. I mean, I'm like one of like three main researchers which are sort of doing that now. Like I wanted to introduce the kind of alien abduction phenomenon because it is obviously related. So, and I don't see people who are trying to really work out the relationship, especially between NDEs and the ufological stuff, or specifically in abduction, for instance. I mean, the other relationship between psychedelics and abduction, let's say, that's variously kind of been done by yeah, I mean, if you look at DMT, for instance, or ayahuasca. So there was this anthropologist, Benny Shannon, who wrote like the Antipodes of the Mind, and he kind of delineated all of these kind of entities that were reported in the ayahuasca and like indigenous sort of circumstances, and categorized a lot of them as like quite clearly what we would at least consider like extraterrestrial kind of nature. And interestingly, they're not really. It's not just like the kind of way in which they look and they're characterized. It's like, so yeah, I mean, I've been in conversation with some people doing some work in Peru with the ayahuasqueros, and they quite clearly like delineate for themselves like what are these other beings, what is the animistic kind of community, the Shipibo, like of a nature which is like entangled like with the natural world, let's say, but then also actual beings which they say are actually extraterrestrials. They're like from this particular planet or star system, and they actually communicate with us in the form of their like UFOs which they're like occupying and things like that. Which is really really quite fascinating, and and that would be under the influence of ayahuasca, for instance. And yeah, I mean, there's been like surveys on DMT entity encounters, and the good proportion of them are like by the respondents are like clearly like designated as what I would best consider like an extraterrestrial. And I've done the DMT field study that I helped run, and then wrote those papers about the nature of the experience, not least like the entity kind of experience. Yeah, we had a good few people who reported these encounters with beings, which we as researchers and they themselves would best sort of conceptualize as what you would immediately consider as like a kind of extraterrestrial. And these performances of these things that they would perform in them, for instance, would be comparable to like alien abduction type phenomenon, like paralysis, and or we at least had this one individual that had something very similar to that, like paralysis, like being on like a table, like this like bright light, these entities as in large heads and eyes, like doing these kind of manipulations, showing them this like weird screen with like these uninterpretable like images and symbols on it, and they were like serpentine kind of in nature. And I mean that I want to mention Tracy Dolan stuff eventually, actually, because that was something from the conference that we met at was really, really struck me. So hopefully I'll get to that and remind me if I don't. But
Yeah, I will.
yeah,
Definitely.
so that's the psychedelic and the abduction stuff. But yeah, I mean, if you want to like ask further about the kind of NDE abduction stuff, which is really, really not as much spoken about, I'll be happy to do that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I mean, you're a neuroscientist, so I think some people's assumption might be that you think those things are phenomena of the brain. But I would notice that in the paper exchanges that you had with Grayson, you were very clear in saying you're not saying there it's a causal relationship, that there's a correlation between things that are happening in the brain with these states and what they're experiencing, but not necessarily that one is causing the other. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, it doesn't sound like you're trying to reduce one thing to the other, but they both do exist contemporaneously, and so that's a relationship that should be investigated, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I am. I had a journalist come visit me recently, and he's like writing this piece about my research on like related, mainly about NDEs and psychedelics and stuff. And we talk about this at quite length, but I think that if I had to be really pressed, just at this moment in my readings and contemplation and stuff, which is ever fluctuating, so you always got to be honest about that, as intellectually honest about that. There's your opinions are changing, and you should never ultimately really have opinions anyway, unless it's just this acceptance of what is ultimately just a human instinct, when you are a scientist and you follow critically like the evidence as far as you can. But then there is this thing to be said about intuition. And I don't want to be one of those scientists who utterly disregard intuition or instinct, because if you fall into that trap, then I think it's quite a tragic sort of state to be in, actually. Like, I think intuition is exceptionally important. And I think when you come to these kind of states after psychedelics, when you become, or not just that, but like meditative experience or whatever, there is this I think kind of some single word which can encapsulate this sense of like noetic kind of flow or whatever, is actually intuition. So yeah, so even as a scientist, there's something to be said about just opining, but in a detached kind of way, so at this point,
Yeah,
I do
I
think that
appreciate
there's
that. I
yeah,
appreciate that about you, because there's a lot of people who have decided before they even really get into the research, and you're not, so that's
yeah,
good.
right, exactly, yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
But yeah, so I think that maybe, I mean, it's it's an arrogant thing for any scientist to be utterly convinced about materialism, and I think there's kind of intriguing shifts, actually, that even these like really like world leading scientists, that I'm acquainted with or like friends with, they they while they're not too different from myself, like while they would generally just say, well, just all we can do is like look at the evidence thus far, and it seems to be erring on the side of this kind of materialistic sort of paradigm, but they're kind of open to the possibility of other things. I think that's really intriguing about our times, the zeitgeist, like a progression of our kind of collective ontologies and things. Like there's
yes,
a
absolutely.
softening of the materialistic kind of designation as being like the kind of be all and end all. But it's still certainly like maybe that's just a reflection of the scientists that I like fraternize with and stuff, right? It's like NDEs people and psychedelic neuroscientists and it may well be that the majority of scientists still would be, yeah, like think that it's farcical to think of anything other than like this materialist kind of approach. But that is ultimately like, when you really think about it, when you really think about the you come to this state of like a type of humility, which is the only condition really which we can be in when we consider the entirety of the universe, from the void, to this very present moment, which is that whole progression is just utterly inexplicable and like miraculous, So to put your money on indisputably on like reductionist kind of view or whatever, it is all it is really is hubris. So I ultimately think that while I try to follow the kind of mechanisms, neuroscientific, but just where I can, and that usually, yeah, it's a sort of from the psychedelic or NDE literature versus kind of general neuroscience literature. I still think that there's the potentiality of, let's say, like kind of perseveration of consciousness after death, and the space, even if that is the correct term to use, in which we arrive would just represent an expanded state of our current science. It's just new science, really, that could possibly parameterize kind of that, but we just don't have the material, really, maybe even like the cognitive like resources to properly conceive of that. And I think that there are psychological reasons for that. That I really, the more and more I think about it, that there is a driver. Like, yes, it's the evidence, but it's also like the kind of the almost yeah, just kind of paradigmatic like attachment to that evidence.
Yeah,
What drives a lot of that is actually of a more emotional, psychological nature,
absolutely.
which in this context I think comes potentially from the idea that there could be anything other than materiality in the universe, or there could be anything other than when you die, that's it. Because what that does is it creates maximal uncertainty. Right? It's not just uncertainty, it's like there may well be zero reference point for which to predict what could happen, let's say, after the point of death. Like, it's not just like where do we go or what happens, but it's just like the terms of that sentence may not even make sense in the space which we might, invoke as possible. And that is like even coming back to the idea of psychedelic neuroscience and things like this entropy in the brain, for instance, like that really is a measure of uncertainty, of unpredictability in the brain. And that in the psychedelic state, like that can create a lot of, people can become acutely panicking. It's kind of this ontological panic. And a similar thing I think can happen when conceiving of like what can happen after death. And so because of that, just in and of itself, I think it belies like these other covert drivers of having such attachment to like reductionism. So I think like I am I don't even myself, like I don't, it's a concern to open up so much to what happens of death because it invites that kind of maximal uncertainty. But so I think on one level it might be courageous for people to do so, but I'm actually also not. I'm also actually very uh, sympathetic to the idea of not doing that, even if it might be more intellectually honest, because actually it may be more grounded and even more prudent to not open yourself up to that because of the effects that it can have on your own life. Basically, just focusing on the here and now, not considering that there might be something after you die, and actually being more immersed in your kind of imminent reality, really. I mean, I think I'm constantly oscillating between the two of those, and it's actually quite challenging for people who do that, I think.
I couldn't agree with what you've just said anymore. You said a bunch of words that are key to that. I mean, I think the paradigmatic, faithfulness that people have. There's also this idea that we've been steadily making progress in the sciences, and that we are getting closer and closer to having things nailed down, pinned down in a comprehensible manner that we can, that is explicable and something that we can, readily grok. And having the humility, like you said, that maybe we don't know as much as we think we do, and that the progress, while I would argue we are making progress, may not be as linear as we assume, and that to admit that could be unsettling and destabilizing. It's sort of the same argument that goes along with like UFO disclosure. Like if there is some information within the UFO question that hints at a non-materiality or whatever, that could be that same kind of unsettling. And one thing that people often talk about is that they're most worried about the sciences in that regard, because then so much of what people have been pursuing for the last, decades gets thrown out the window. But at the same time, like, I mean, science itself is serving to sort of undermine that materiality with, research that's been done in quantum physics. And I know people often throw quantum physics out there to say, see, and they don't really understand it. And I'm not pretending to understand it, but I know that there are questions raised about, locality and, those sorts of things that, I don't think that we as a culture or as a species have really come to terms with. It's like we know that it happens on a very small scale, but we still don't know what that means on a larger scale. And I think that by and large, we're kind of afraid of the question, because if that unsettles our conception of reality, where do we go from there? How do we begin to think of who we are and what it may mean? But it's fascinating to me that you keep an open mind toward the survivability of consciousness. And a lot of people in your position don't and wouldn't admit it if they did, because they feel like it might undermine them among some of their more materialistic colleagues. So I appreciate that courage. And I think that you should be commended for it. One thing that I have read recently over the last couple of years is I read a couple of books by Stanislav Grof. And he did some psychedelic research, and then he got into holotropic breathing and whatnot. And he claimed that there was a transpersonal dimension that people often landed in when they were taking high levels of LSD under controlled circumstances. And he believed that that was a real thing. Do you have any sense through the work that you've done or the conversations you've had, the books you've read, whether that's true? Is there something below the human subconscious that works like a collective consciousness or whatever else that is ontologically real rather than being some kind of visionary state?
That's your first question. It's like it is no sort of trivial thing to try and answer. I mean, these are the kind of questions which aliens have the answer to. Yeah,
We hope.
that's well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it might be like facetious sort of saying that, but that is one key reason why the alien question fascinates me so much, because of what they know. If you just at least like endorse the possibility of their existence or even like presence, and but mainly on this level of the nature of ontology and the consciousness and indeed like death, and not only what they know about it, but are they, is there a relationship between what they do know, kind of advanced knowledge they do have about it, and actually their implication in it, like they in those processes. But yeah, so I don't know, I'm kind of deflecting the question a bit, but there's there's so you've got this inexplicable phenomenology, and then you've also got holes, gaping chasms in our understanding of the brain and consciousness. I mean, I'd say that, but that's just a reflection of just how vast the brain is. Like, actually, I mean, I was just at a conference in Japan, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. Anyway, and it's what I was saying earlier about arrogance of some scientists. Like, I actually get it, because when you're someone that has such a grokking of the mechanisms of the natural world, which just outstrip the vast majority of the rest of the population of the planet, like you're kind of entitled to be entirely hubristic, in a way. So we do actually have an amazing, or some people do have an amazing understanding of the brain. It's just to say, like, it's just a testament to the vastness of it. It's like we can say that simultaneously to saying that there's still this gaping chasm of lack of understanding from the brain and like an ultimately conscious experience. And so you get very beguiling like phenomenology when it comes to, if you're in terms of your question, like psychedelics. I mean, and often, like you're saying about, I'm maybe catching stuff in like neuroscientific terms that people might assume that I'm being like reductionistic about it, and often that's what is said about, I work with psychedelics and near-death experiences, because the assumption that I'm reducing it to it being a product of a hallucinogen, or endogenous like hallucinogenic activity, but really these psychedelic experiences, even if we have characterized quite a lot of their kind of neurological kind of substrates, like even within that, there are parts of the experience that's difficult to explain. Parapsychological kind of stuff, like people having precognitive type visions, and of this sense of, I mean, on one level, I always have recourse to these kind of particular events, if it's like precognition, or if it's like having an out-of-body experience from them, which is apparently veridical in some way. You might be K-holing, whatever, so you're ultimately in this kind of unconscious but like disconnected state of consciousness, and like on the floor, closed eyes, and you actually correctly report after recovering like things that are going on and stuff like that. And but yeah, and there are other things, like I'm saying about the near-death experience being comparable to psychedelics. And like one thing which is super interesting with NDEs, which is often reported, is like the peak Indarian experience. Is a weird name, but it's there we go. Which is when you encounter the deceased like a deceased individual, and you maybe didn't know them, or didn't know you did know them, but you didn't know that they're actually dead at that point. And
Yeah.
there certainly needs to be more systematic studies on that, because there's only really like one paper from Bruce Grayson like a while ago which lists like a dozen or whatever. But it could be, they're amazing, but at this stage it could be like a statistical like anomaly, like the coincidence that, because sometimes you do actually encounter the deceased. Sorry, you do encounter humans who aren't actually dead. The vast majority of them are people who are dead, and that's kind of interesting in and of itself. But if you also sometimes see people who aren't, they could be this, albeit like curious, like coincidental thing where you happen to see people who were dead, but you just didn't know it, like were later sort of found out to be dead and things like that. But it's still really, really interesting. And I've kind of, again, no systematic study of this, but there should be, of that kind of similar thing happening in psychedelics. Like occasionally, you come across those kind of reports and things like that. But so they're all interesting. I think even just the phenomenal state of this expanded state of consciousness, like just I mean, it's one of the main dimensions of this kind of experience is like its ineffability, right? So sort of makes sense for me to sort of trip up on my words when I try to describe it. But this very preternatural like feeling, experience of like almost an infinite reservoir of consciousness, which has which seems to be not constrained by like parameters like space or time, and it's like sense of total communion with like foundation knowledge, as well as importantly having almost like a sacred quality to it. Like when you're kind of immersed in something like that, it is very hard to see how any mechanistic framework for relationship between consciousness and the brain would be acceptable, really. So I think it's there may be this expanded kind of science, as I kind of alluded to before, but one which again, sort of referencing something we mentioned earlier, like there's an inclusion of the brain with something beyond it, where you have to accept the correlational nature of experience in the brain. Like you have to accept that. So the conditioning of the actual content of the experience seems to be like inextricably linked to the brain. But it doesn't necessarily mean that consciousness itself relies on it. But then if it doesn't, our language and our just frameworks just break down as to, well, what would that even look like? Like for consciousness to be just not quote unquote like within the brain. I don't know. And there's like kind of curious things like with mediums, for instance, when they're putatively connecting with the dead, and some of them report that while there's like veridical information coming through, and I think again when you really look into it, you have to accept that some of these cases are maybe undeniable, like some of them. Some of these mediums report that like the way in which that is happening is actually some kind of leveraging of their own kind of content of their own psyche. Like so their brain is intrinsic kind of part of this communication process. So it's sort of it paints some kind of picture of there being some information from, let's say, the deceased, which no longer have a nervous system, and then the actual association of a brain within a medium, let's say, so it's just one example of trying to kind of think about that. But
some sort of like an akashic kind of field or whatever that we're all maybe embedded in, to use some of the lingo. That's fascinating. One of the things that gets thrown around a lot is that the brain being is a transceiver of consciousness, and that sort of like like a radio set. It of course has states and actions that it goes through when it's channeling consciousness, but it's not necessarily the broadcast tower that's putting out the signal. Does that have any utility to you, or does that seem oversimplified? Or, I mean, is that still an open question? Could that be, I guess, is a better way to frame it.
I think, yeah, at this stage, all of these things could be, but that it gives an impression of a kind of a dualistic thing. And that's a kind of perennially difficult thing to reconcile, like the so-called interaction problem. It's like, well, if there is this, yeah, if like the brain is like a transceiver, it still kind of gives this sense that the brain is like there is this material world and then there's this other thing and they interface, so like how does that work? But I guess a spin on that is a more panpsychic or really like an idealist perspective where everything is ultimately like constituted by consciousness, and but then they can also apply this kind of language, or it was like the brain is like a transceiver, and like to me it's like I've asked different panpsychics about this and they haven't given me a kind of satisfactory answer of like, well, how is that any better than what we have now about in terms of the mainstream thing about about, well, if there's a problem with, well, how does the brain produce consciousness? It's like, well, how does consciousness produce the brain, for one thing? And also, how does that work in terms of the consciousness is producing the brain while simultaneously the brain is filtering or transceiving that consciousness? Like, that may be a really good model, but it's just at this level, like the explanations for it haven't like compelled me, or at least from what I've heard thus far. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a good answer. Well, I've got someone who knows things. What about Hammeroff and Penrose's Orch-R theory? I mean, I'm sure you've that's been thrown at you a bunch. Do you think that is, apparently there's been discoveries that have sort of seemed to back that up, or at least not disqualify it. I'm obviously not versed in too much of that technical stuff, but I mean, do you think that could be an explanation for consciousness or not?
I'm not like exceptionally like versed in that, but yeah, I'm certainly like aware of it and read things, and it's interesting. It's so because of the quantum physical kind of element of it, it's not really a model that I'm ever going to like fully comprehend, to be perfectly honest. But the microtubular and anesthetic kind of stuff, yeah, is interesting. So, I it's interesting that this idea of quantum models of consciousness is growing traction. Like in like mainstream circles of this, like these academic conferences and things. And yeah, the Orch-R one is just one of several. So it's not something at the moment to just totally dismiss of like, just because we can't understand consciousness and we can't understand quantum physics. Ultimately, like, let's just lump them in the same box and maybe they'll explain one another. Like,
which happens a
can't
lot.
be.
But,
Yeah, but you can't be totally dismissive like that because like I say, like there is this growing acceptance of the possibility of different models of quantum consciousness, and we've got it's certainly accepted that that there are quantum processes in biology. Beforehand, even that was considered not possible, but now that is definitely accepted. Just the kind of classic examples like photosynthesis, and it's like that is the best model. Like it doesn't really work if you don't allow for quantum tunneling processes. So we know that, yeah, they're basically these quantum processes which are thought to just come under decoherence and therefore like not work if they're in this warm and wet kind of biological environment, but actually seems possible. So like, why not the brain? And yeah, it's yeah, there's another there's I mean, just on an anecdotal level, like I just had an interesting ayahuasca experience where it was quite a vivid um, and compelling kind of experience of kind of building in my mind this the evolution of structures in nature which harnessed the quantum processes inherent in like the fabric of the universe for the purposes of uh, conscious experience. Ultimately, it was very, very interesting. Like the um,
How did you
yeah, which is
receive that?
basically what.
How did you receive that information? If you don't mind me, I'd love to hear more about like that experience, if you don't mind.
How did I receive it? Oh, I mean, it was. Who knows if it was a reception of experience? I mean, this in itself comes back to the kind of quandaries of consciousness. It's like I just had
Yeah.
that experience. Like, of course, you can just say, "Oh, well, I'm just interested in this stuff." So I just had because we also know that psychedelics enhance creativity, especially even scientifically, like creative insight and like novel innovation and stuff like that, which itself has been in the field of like molecular biology, for instance, like apocryphally, like even Crick, I mean, we know
Yeah,
that he was really
DNA, right?
he did acid and all the stuff. Yeah, exactly. But and then apocryphally he had the kind of this insight of the helical structure, under acid. Who knows? But certainly, it's the altered states generally are like undoubtedly implicated in very important. I mean, Carrie Mullis, for instance, who developed polymerase chain reaction of like reliably like duplicating DNA material. Like he said in his Nobel Prize winning speech for that he had that idea under acid. So for instance, but so even in my case, like I was under the influence of a psychedelic, and I was happened to be, for whatever reason, at that moment thought about the Ochoa theory, and but it was enhanced, the depth at which I was able to conceive of the implications or like how it might work was far beyond just my waking mind just tinkering around with the idea. So it could clearly be something like that. Not to say that there wasn't some veracity maybe to it. I mean, I'll never know until the Ochoa theory is like proven. But yeah, it was. I mean, because ultimately it was just an insight into what nature does. Right? The, that's what biology is. Like it literally came out of a vacuum, right? And is just a process which is itself grokking the principles of which preceded it for its own expansion and increasing complexification, and adaptiveness to the universe. So this is sort of what I was applying to this idea of like neurons. So if we think if neuroscience is the bedrock of like consciousness, it's still, yeah, I just had this basically, yeah, just this sort of visionary insight into the way that might work, like harnessing fundamental principles of the universe, like quantum physics, and just microtubules figured out how to do that through natural selective kind of processes for the purpose of having experience. So obviously that's always the question of evolution, right? It's like, well, it, everything that we see is only because of its survival value, the structures in the natural world and stuff. But
Yeah.
so the question is, well, why though? And it's always just why. Like why did it evolve to adapt to just to have this trait, which then allows it to survive and propagate? So okay, yeah, it has that trait to propagate, but then why? And
Exactly.
that becomes an existential question. Um, and I think that's all going to be inextricably linked to experience. It's like, is there a point in anything developing and evolving if there's no experience, which then kind of implies that experience is the point, and then kind of implies that the answer to that question, why, of all of these things developing to survive, is to experience. Um,
Which goes back to like the perennial philosophy and the idea of a minded universe. I mean, it sort of hints, it connects with some rather mystical ideas, which I'm all in favor of. But it's interesting. Um, you mentioned Tracy Doland. I want to remind you if there's something there that you wanted to talk about that I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because I was, before the interview, I was just thinking about my reflection on the conference generally. And I was giving a talk on, I was giving two talks. One on kind of neuroscientific models of alien abduction phenomena, and then also the kind of spiritual relevance, of alien abduction, or vice versa. What's why is the alien abduction phenomenon like relevant for spirituality and near-death experiences and things?
They
But then,
are,
yeah, also,
because people that have those experiences often experience a spiritual awakening of sorts, and it turns their whole thing around into a whole different kind of mindset often, that's common for those experiences.
yeah, exactly. And I think, when you're in the community and things, you kind of know that. But if you're kind of outside of it, you don't. You just think of it as, yeah, like just metal sources in the sky and little green men kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's my primary interest in the abduction phenomenon, like what relevance it has for that. And so Dolan's experience, like Tracy's case reports that she was presenting at the conference, I mean, she just had one remarkable case. I mean, when you read an abduction phenomenon, like, and especially like John Mack's stuff, which, when he's like really assiduously kind of characterize a lot of these uh, experiences, which could be quite elaborate. Like Tracy's one was at least equally as astonishing. Like, so basically, it was this older guy, like in his 60s, and he's just going to the toilet in the middle of the night, as you do when you're that age, or even if you're my age. um, Unfortunately. And yeah, in that trivial of states, like he saw this like immense, like black brick, like kind of ship in the sky, became paralyzed, um, uh, had this feeling, this like shocking feeling in his spine. The room was flooded with like this white light, um, and heard a voice communicating, "Do not resist." And then found himself in this kind of underneath, like this kind of light, this pyramidal like light structure, um, and then also kind of surrounded by like this, like yeah, it's like rectangular kind of space it was in, uh, with this light shining from the other end, um, and then in that space, like, encountered this entity which was cloaked, save for its like head, which itself was quite like a UFO, like saucer-like, like enormous, flat, like cranium, and and it had these like almost optic fiber like things, like tubes, within this kind of mechanism like surrounding him, tubes of light, yeah, and some other kind of details. But I was just really, oh yeah, and this kind of screen, there's this kind of film. It's like partitioned himself in this entity, and it was streaming with different kind of symbols and things which you can interpret. And so very elaborate, kind of baroque. And then, I just done this presentation on the psychological and neuroscientific kind of models of this kind of phenomena, right? This kind of abduction phenomena, and none of them could really satisfactorily explain something like that. But obviously, I just had lots of resonance. Like, despite the bizarreness of it, it obviously had lots of resonances with like the near-death experience. Like, he literally, I mean, there was this flooding of like white light. So there's these broader things which aren't that interesting, because really they're kind of just a fundamental narrative structure of any experience anyone has, like going to somewhere and meeting beings, So there's that, obviously. But yeah, there's this intense kind of white light, and even at the end of a kind of like tunnel-like structure, and he, yeah, and also remarkably akin to certain DMT reports, which which were included in the field study that I co-conducted as well, of yeah, this kind of paralytic experience of being shown inexplicable like symbols and glyph like things or what have you on a kind of technological screen which you have no kind of precedence for and things like that. And so for many on many kind of levels, it's super interesting. Yeah, so I just wanted to just at least mention that because that was a striking thing that I remember from the conference. But I guess I don't relate just lastly on that because you did mention disclosure earlier, and that was another main thing that I really took away from the conference, especially from because there's so much about disclosure at that conference, but especially Nick Pope, because he had a whole talk on it, and I was just I just came away not at ease fully with it's seemingly everyone that I spoke to, uh, their desire, kind of very zealous desire for disclosure. Like it seemed like they hadn't fully thought it through. It's like, what are the, if you really think about it, what are the actual implications of disclosure? And like Nick Pope like went through that very eloquently, I thought. There's just simple things of like, well, even the if everyone was just, even if it wasn't like a face-to-face kind of disclosure, like just some announcement of I mean, this is the whole conversation obviously about control disclosure. And basically, we've got like governmental acceptance that there are UFOs, but it's like everyone's just pottering about their days if nothing's ever happened. So that's experimentally interesting in itself. But like, there hasn't been such a forthright announcement, So if that does happen, then things like there'll be uh, societal and economic issues. It's like just generally the market doesn't like uncertainty, so that will just kind of flip on its head. People will like withdraw money, things like that. I mean, it is very interesting what we see in terms of our lives. Like, I don't know, I haven't quite decided yet because you can see things like, when they're collective things which are the people kind of experience, like they can disproportionately like overreact in a anxious kind of way. But then also there's this thing, as I said before, it's like, well, we've actually got governmental acceptance that there are things in our skies which we absolutely have no idea what they are, and literally the world keeps ticking on. So it's interesting that those two kind of currently like coexist. But then you got that all the way to the like, they may have technology which is beyond us, so that increases our uncertainty. It may be technology which has the potential to be extremely like life-threatening. So just the potential of that increases uncertainty even more. There's the question, obviously, of their intent. And so if they're malign and they're going to wield such life-threatening technology, that's kind of worst case scenario, right? But it seems that from looking at all of the evidence, like if they certainly are here and have been here forever, basically, there's no immediate hostile intent unless it's a very kind of long game covert kind of thing, which you can certainly argue for as well. But yeah, I think the most interesting thing, coming back to this thing about Dolan's case and everything, there's the ontological implications, which are the most important and pressing, I think, for me. Like they would totally deconstruct current theologies, right? And psychologically, like I was saying before, like even if you do open yourself up to life after death, let's say, whatever, and there may be these defense mechanisms for not doing that. Obviously, that's one key function of religious frameworks, right? Because it then reduces that uncertainty. It gives you certain models even within that possibility to like deal with. It's like you have some uncertainty about that uncertainty. So yeah, there's like if that threatens our religious structure and things like that's very threatening. But then again, we've got this incredible capacity as human beings to just incorporate whatever completely novel, seemingly like uncertainty maximizing kind of information into our present models. Like we just adapt, and that's what the brain does, and human beings do the best, really. So that's going to be interesting to see how our brain, albeit different brains across just the world, like reacting differently, is going to adapt to that. But ultimately, I just think like lastly, just that last thing, like Pope. One thing he said is, I mean, he referenced like there were just a couple of people in the conference who were talking about death, and I was one of them, and the other person I believe was actually Danny and Brinkley, and I went to that talk, and he actually didn't talk about the relevance of the abduction phenomena for his ideas about NDEs at all. So it's basically just me. And then Pope, which I'm mentioning that and saying that if you imagine that these entities that are interacting with us are maybe the dead or our ancestors or whatever, hence their kind of interest in relevance for us, then not only have you got indisputable proof of just these other beings, but you've got indisputable proof of life after death. And like that is like human beings just on the whole aren't ready for that. Even people who are deeply religious, it's actually a different thing, faith and actual unmitigated evidence. You even could have experiential knowledge of that, but like empirical knowledge of that is a whole different game. And even those people could be vulnerable to that kind of knowledge. So I think ultimately, yeah, it's like I came away from that talk in the conference generally thinking, how is like disclosure is clearly impossible. So I think, yeah, it's going to be a long time unless there is a kind of disclosure which ends up being so-called like catastrophic.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And the state of the world right now with all of the divisions, and then you have, huge pockets of millions of people utterly dedicated to their own particular religious or social worldview. And if that gets undermined all of a sudden with something that, is sort of proves some parts of their thinking or their ontology, but complicates it and makes it something utterly different, people may react violently, and that could be horrific. And that holds true for every segment of society, and there's no way of knowing where that ultimately ends up. So I mean, it could be horrifying. I still want to know, and that's the root of, I think, a lot of people's argument for disclosure is that they personally want to know what the reality is. And there's a part of me that's like, if the government or people who are, in these, military, what do you call them, contractor companies have knowledge that sort of bears on what's really real in the universe, then we should have a right to that information. But if the consequences are going to be so horrific, how do you balance stability and order versus this democratic ideal that we're all deserving of ontological information? And I'm glad I'm not having to answer that question, because that's a big responsibility, and I understand the complexities. That being said, it does seem like we're moving in that direction. It does seem like there's been a bread trail left by somebody or some interest to kind of push this conversation along. So there may be an X factor looming to where it's going to be demonstrated to us anyway. So the powers that be want to get out ahead of it, or it's all just some fantasy that we're collectively sharing, which could also be true.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, I appreciate your time, man. That's pretty much all I had for you. We're at an hour, so I didn't mean to get right in on the meat questions, but that's what I'm after. So I appreciate you playing along.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. No, I'm glad for that as well. To be certainly, these are the most profound of questions to ask, and try and explore with one another. So yeah, appreciate that, and yeah, really happy to have chatted. It's really fun. Thank you, man.